First of all, I would like to thank Glenn and Anne and the organisers of this event. They've asked me to come down and speak here. The Digital Week initiative is one which seems to have gathered momentum this year, and it's great to see as part of that Digital Week initiative a programme which is a discursive programme. A moment of reflection and critical dialogue is always a good idea. It is important in the times that we are in that critical dialogue and reflection are given time to counteract populist political discourses which seem to be gaining strength around us at the moment. My talk here today will be broken down into 4 parts. I'm going to keep an eye on the time because I think I maybe have too much. What I'll do is kind of situate some of my own areas of research. As Sheila mentioned, I'm kind of more recently, since about 2012. Yeah. Okay. Will I start again? Or is...
No,
okay. I can stand if that's better. Right. So since 2012, I have become involved in more critical philosophical discussions around technology. That's in particular in relation to a group of philosophers and intellectuals that Sheila mentioned called Ars Industrialis, which is a group founded about 10 years ago now, which are looking at the impact of technologies, in particular digital technologies, on society. So some of the things I'm going to talk about towards the end really are about current research activities that I'm involved in. Okay. The first part of the talk will be an overview of the concept of the Anthropocene, which is a kind of a buzzword which is around, and even I've seen it kind of in the art world in particular. It kind of seems to have gained a bit of credence in certain areas. Even if you think about the last Biennale, the Finnish house had a lot of artwork which was about this relationship between man, nature, and art. So what I'm going to do, as Glenn said, I'm going to try and unpack this a little bit. There are kind of different versions of the story, and I'm going to set out one which is based on a book which was just translated into English, which is called The Shock of the Anthropocene. It's a very good book. It was published in France about 2 years ago, and it's just been translated into English. That's a kind of deconstructive reading of the Anthropocene. So what I mean by that, it's going to set up a certain reading of how the Anthropocene came about and what it is. So the Anthropocene relates to the notion of techne and technology. So that's the second piece I'm going to talk about. So if we imagine the first piece, I'm going to try and give a genealogy of the term, give a definition of it. And within doing that, what happens is the question no longer becomes what's the Anthropocene, but it becomes the question what's human and what is becoming human, or how did we become human. So those two questions go together. And within that then, we have a notion of technology and techne, which is going to be the second part of the talk. And what I will argue for is an expanded notion of technology, an expanded notion of digital technology, and that's the relationship between becoming human and the Anthropocene. The third part of the talk, which is kind of the title around new economies, what I'm going to do, if we get there, is talk about the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler's work in relation to this concept that he has put forward through that intellectual platform, Ars Industrialis, which he is calling the contributive economy. And the last part, if we get there, is going to talk about some of the research I'm doing with the Digital Studies Network. But I'm just very aware that I have a lot of text and it's very dense, so I'm going to go quite slowly. And if I run out of time, we can come to it in the Q&A. Is that okay? Right. So the slide, you can roll it there, Colette. You go into maybe the first of yeah, that's fine. So the first part I've called the anthropo-what. The anthropos, the ant, the tro, the po, and the what. The term Anthropocene has a specific genealogy that can be dated to particular texts and to a particular discipline, geology. But the term raises fundamental questions about what it is to be human. We are already in the Anthropocene. It is our epoch, our time, the times of humans, hence integrating the question that defining the Anthropocene is also defining the human. The discipline of geology deals with very large time frames and a planetary scale. So therefore the idea of a new geological period raises some issues around proof and evidence of change. That's what Sheila alluded to. What we have here is, because of the time frames and the scale that we're talking about, it's very difficult to say exactly what's happening, which I try and explain a bit. Okay. So there's an issue of evidence and proof. However, I think it was in the COP in Paris in August, we do now have, within geology, a general acceptance that we have moved into the Anthropocene. The debate is really about when, which I'll come to in a second. So, to simplify things here for a moment, I'm going to hold the clear parallel between two questions in suspension, a bracketing of the implications of one into the other. The simple version is the term Anthropocene was first pronounced in February 2000 in a colloquium of the International Programme of Geosphere-Biosphere in Mexico. The atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, a Nobel Prize winner for his groundbreaking work on the ozone layer, announced during the colloquium, "No, we are no longer in the Halocene, but in the Anthropocene." This is a new epoch, a new geological time frame. As Bruno Latour has pointed out, this is a geological distinction. It is akin to talking about tectonic plates and the geology of the Earth shifting as they push against each other. So the Anthropocene is a change in the very rock foundation of the planet that we live on. The influence of humans has changed the geological structure of the planet. That's the plane of the Anthropocene. Crutzen sets out the details of this proposition in a 2002 Nature article entitled "The Geology of Mankind." It's quite short, it's only a one-page article. Here he sets out the argument that mankind has had a direct impact on the geology of the planet. This is still, however, a contested hypothesis. The contestation is not over the fact that mankind is having an impact on the planet, i.e., it is not because in geology there is a debate about the shifting epoch from Halocene to Anthropocene that the lasting impact of mankind is being denied or that climate change is being denied. So to be clear on that, within geology the debate is about when we situate the Anthropocene, not about the Anthropocene itself. The Greek term, I think it's the next slide. No, that'll do. Okay. The Greek term anthropos means to be human. Kainos means recent or new. Hence, Anthropocene is a new period of humans, the age of mankind. The characteristic of the Anthropocene, according to Paul Crutzen, is the impact on the natural environment, which is having lasting effects. The idea that humans are having a lasting impact on the natural environment is not new. I mean, you can think of, this is, when I was writing this the other day, you can even think of natural philosophy in the Middle Ages. We had this kind of embedded relationship between man and nature. So it's not a new idea. Okay? And even in the 1780s, Buffon and George James Watt, around the 1780s, spoke about the impact of man on the environment as a point of debate. And actually what they were talking about was the impact of the gases from the new factories that were built in the cities on agriculture. That's what they were talking about in the 1780s. So it's not a new idea. The recent book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, published by Christophe Brunel and Jean-Baptiste Ferros, gives a more deconstructive reading of the term and the effects of the Anthropocene, and is their work that I shall refer to here. Nonetheless, as we shall see in a few moments, the analysis of the Anthropocene is linked, on the one hand, to the development of technology, and the other, to the very understanding of what it means to be human. The next piece of argumentation within the Anthropocene, within Anthropocene studies, is the question of when does the Anthropocene start? As the references to Buffon and Watt indicate, there is one theory that suggests that the new period, the period of the Anthropocene, started in the 1870s. And this would correspond to the development of the steam engine, which leads to the development of industrialization, through the development of the railway system, which leads to the development of industry, which leads to the Industrial Revolution. Here we can see a clear link between notions of thermodynamics, the invention of the second law of thermodynamics, which is called entropy, and that's what Stiegler is going to play around with this term Anthropocene and Anthropocene, so entropy, as in the second law of thermodynamics. Here we can see that there's a relationship between the development of the steam engine and the onset of the Anthropocene. Here, for the first time, we have mechanical modes of production which lead to large-scale shifts within the processes of production themselves. Nonetheless, the key point here is that the period of the Anthropocene can be dated to the development of the steam engine in the 1860s and 1870s. There are also ontological considerations about the role of change and evolution, which I do not have time to explain here, but I would note that we have in the context the development of Darwinism, the theory of evolution. We have within linguistics, we have Humboldt's understanding of language, and both of these, with the laws of thermodynamics, indicate that there is no longer a stability in the objects themselves, that the objects are in some type of state of change, whether that be language. What Humboldt sets out very clearly is that language is something which is constantly changing. If you think about Darwin's theory of evolution, it's setting out that things are in a constant state of evolution. And in terms of ontology in philosophy, that poses a question about things being in a state of becoming as opposed to being. So that's the kind of side issue that's in the background. However, there is another set of opinions that would argue, I think this is the next slide. Yeah, okay, this one here, yeah. It's very busy. There is another set of opinions, and see the journal. So we have a journal of the Anthropocene, okay, which started in April 2014. And in that journal, when you look at the title of the articles, what you can see is this type of debate about situating things in time, etc. So the second opinion is that the Anthropocene starts after what's called the great or grand acceleration of the 1950s. That's what this slide is. This is what they call the dashboard of the Anthropocene. So you can go in and see each of these kind of key KPI factors which have influenced man's impact on the planet. Okay? And this is open software. This is freely available. You can download all these statistics and look at them yourself. Okay? But what all of these statistics indicate is that there are drastic changes between the relationship of man and nature and man's influence on the biosphere and atmosphere. So again here, the debate within Anthropocene studies is that either we're talking about the 1860s and 1870s or we're talking about this period of time which is after the 1950s. I think that we'd go to the next one. I think I've just taken one or two in detail. Yeah, like world population, for example. So you can see, like, world population from 1950, we have an exponential growth. And this is the key point in the debates is what happens in the 1940s and 1950s to get this sudden growth of population, sudden increase of CO2, etc., etc. Okay. So these clearly indicate that from the 1950s onwards, we have a sudden change in the impact of man, or the impact of mankind on the planet. Hence the term acceleration or grand acceleration. Okay. So, again here, what's interesting, you could say, well, maybe interesting is not the right word, but what we have is a parallel between a sudden development of a form of consumerism, consumer capitalism, from the 1940s, 1950s, the development of consumerism in general, and this is linked again to a growth of the Anthropocene. So you can see within both questions, whether it's the 1860s or the 1950s, what we have in the context around it is a sudden development of a form of political economy. From a critical perspective, you could say from a Marxist perspective, therefore the background to the Anthropocene is about the development of particular modes of labour, particular modes of production, and particular modes of exchange. Within Bernard Stiegler's analysis of labour, there is a form of individual gesture being reproduced when the automated processes are placed within machine labour. Now, just to explain what happens here is that the term that Bernard Stiegler is going to refer to from the proletariat, so this is a very Marxist reading of it, what he's going to call proletarianization, is that when we take individual gestures of labour and they are translated into automatic processes, what we get is a loss of memory. So the gesture is broken down into individual discrete elements. Those discrete elements are reproduced within the machine, if you wish, and within that we have a loss of memory, and that's what he means by proletarianization. Now, a key text on this is Marx' text called Grundis, and in Grundis he has a very, very short article about what is production, and within that short article Marx sets out also this loss of memory through translation of individual gesture into discrete units into machinic labour. Okay. But when we speak of loss of knowledge, here what we're speaking of is loss of practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge, which is, again, if in the Q&A I can talk about that if anybody wants to talk about that. It kind of comes from Immanuel Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason. He makes a distinction between practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. Okay. Now, within this book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, what we get are not just the Anthropocene. Like when I was looking at it yesterday, I have a whole list. Okay, so Anthropocene is one. Then we have, I was going to list them all out. We have the Thermocene. So the Thermocene is to do with fossil fuels and heat, and thermos. Then we have the Agnocene. That's a really interesting one. That's like denial. So this is like, if you wish, climate change denial. Okay. Then we have the Capitalocene, which is the one based on capitalism. So each if you wish, each subcategory tries to explain how, if you wish, one simple way of doing it is saying, how did we get to such a point that we ignored that we were having an impact on the planet? Now, in their book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, what they do is they point out that we did know what we were doing. Okay, it wasn't a surprise. Okay, and that's where you get this kind of curious tension within the book, is setting out that this is what the Anthropocene is, but at the same time revealing that at each one of these subcategories we have a kind of a recognition that we knew what we were doing. Okay, so the Capitalocene, as the name suggests, refers to the relationship between capital and the impact on the planet. The accumulation of capital wealth through the development of modes of transport, techno-infrastructure, railways, dams, container ships, the development of financial modes of transaction, all together tip mankind into the Anthropocene. The accumulation of a 130-fold wealth between the 1700s and 2008. So this is taken from Thomas Piketty's Capital of the 21st Century. So that's a book which created quite a lot of fuss about 2.5 years ago. We had this huge tome which explains capital in the 21st century, but within it we have a lot of statistics, and one of them is that between 1700 and 2008 we've had a 130-fold increase in the accumulation of wealth. So the development of modes of production and modes of industrial technoscience have led to the Anthropocene. As I stated, this is the simple version. The simple version in the sense that we have a kind of clear, linear logic, cause, effect. Okay. And as I said, in the Shock of the Anthropocene, they demonstrate that this was done not out of ignorance. People knew what they were doing. Okay. Now, that's kind of setting out, that's the background. Okay, so that's just saying what the Anthropocene is in a very simple way. Okay. Now, the next piece that I'm going to try and do is show that there are problems with this version of the story. Okay. And the main problem is to do with an understanding of technology. Right? Stiegler argues and gives a very detailed critique of the book, The Shock of the Anthropocene. So Bernard Stiegler argues that the issue is about a misunderstanding of technology and a misunderstanding of what techne is. So what I'm going to try and do is kind of throw some light on that critique. Now, I'm always wary of this because we get into what sometimes we call Stiegler speak or Stieglerese, because he has a tendency to invent his own terms and play around with terms. So bear with me for a minute, and I don't mind if somebody says stop. This is just way too much. Okay, hopefully it won't. Okay, so what we're going to get in Stiegler is, if we accept that we have this term Anthropocene for a second, what we're going to get in Stiegler is a critique which is like a negative mirror image of that, and he's going to call that the neg-Anthropocene. Okay, and here he's playing around with a number of things in the background. He's playing around with the term entropy, which is the second law of thermodynamics, that energy dissipates. That's what it is. And neg-entropy, which is from Schrödinger, which is the opposite. So if we have Anthropocene, then we have the neg-Anthropocene, which is some type of negative mirror image of it. Okay? And if we're saying that we have notions of entropy, so dissipation of energy across time, okay, the critique is, how do we get out of the Anthropocene? So what he's going to suggest is that we have to go in the opposite direction. That's putting it quite simply. Right? Now, the second part, which I've called technophilia and technophobia, and I like that kind of playing around with technophobia. So that tends to be the type of discourse that we hear. Either technology is going to do everything, or we should get rid of technology. So we have to find a way in the middle. Right? So what we need to do, and I'm not the only person to do this, there's a whole group of people historically involved in this conversation, is to widen the understanding of what technology is. Okay? Technology is not just things, machines which are built in the world. We are technology, and we become human through technology. Technology is a process of mediation in the world. There's another French philosopher, Gilbert Simondon. He has a fantastic book which is called The Mode d'existence des objets techniques, which is the mode of existence of technical objects. Unfortunately, we only have the first piece has been translated. But in the very first page of that book, Simondon says that we mediate ourselves through aesthetic and technical objects. Okay, so we mediate ourselves in the world through technical and aesthetic objects. And what he means by that is that we become human through that activity of technical and aesthetic objects. I was going to take an image. I don't know if you saw the National Geographic from January 2015. Okay, if you look at the front page, what you see is these fantastic images of the cave paintings in France and in Spain and Africa. Okay, but the title is that we become human through art. That's the title. Okay. So here, within Simondon, we have a similar argument that we become human through processes of mediation in the world, which are through technical objects and aesthetic objects. However, to do that, we have to understand that technology is something which is wider than notions of objects in the world, that we mediate ourselves in the world through technology. So philosophically, we can go back to the early Greeks and think of the term techne. Techne means skills, craft. Logos, which is reason, thinking. I am therefore promoting an understanding of techne and technology as something which is intrinsically human or part of becoming human. It's not separate to it. The question is sometimes posed incorrectly. That is, a question of being for or against technology. We are technology in the most profound sense, in the sense that we become human through processes of mediation in the world. Stiegler has a kind of nice way of explaining this. He says it's like asking the question, are you for or against the sun? The question doesn't make any sense. Okay. Now, within that, however, we have a notion of becoming human, becoming individuated, becoming an individual, okay, which takes place through those processes of techne and technology. Okay. I could give a very simple example. Your mobile phone, which recently I cracked the screen on the mobile phone, and now I've lost all my contacts. So when people ring, I don't know who they are. Okay, so I have to kind of go, who's that? Right? But more importantly, it's kind of a story that I tell. At one point, somebody asked me for my home telephone number. Okay, and I'd moved house, and God, I didn't know what my home telephone number was, because on my mobile phone it said home. Okay? But more importantly, if I lose my mobile phone today, I don't lose a telecommunications device whereby I communicate with other people. What I lose is memory. I lose a piece of myself which has been placed in the technical object. Okay. So that's kind of putting it simply. But the idea again here is that within my processes of mediation in the world, that's how I become who I am. Now, okay, so the next piece is 3 minutes left. Oh my God, I'm only on page 3. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'm just going to do a little bit.
A little bit of movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't really unpack it enough. All right. I'm going to try. We have. Within that understanding of technology as a process of mediation and becoming individuated in the world, we have and this is why I think Stiegler's analysis is so powerful. Okay, we have within it a mobilization of what he calls pharmacology. Okay, so pharmacology traditionally is the study of pharmacon or pharmaca. So if I take aspirin, for example, if I take too much aspirin, it'll kill me. So pharmacology has been traditionally the dosage of cure and poison together. That's what it has been. Okay. So Stiegler puts forward an understanding of technology which is based on this notion of pharmacology, and there's a specific history of that, which I might take just the last 3 minutes to explain, and then we can talk more in the Q&A. So what we have is, I think there's a quotation there, Glenn. Go on. That's the book. That's a nice picture. We'll come back to this. So today's this one here. Okay. Right, that's fine. Okay. That's wow, that's big on the screen. Okay, so the term pharmacon, so just to say who's who, okay, so Bernard Stiegler is a contemporary French philosopher. He is very involved in the media, he's around quite a lot in French society, but he's also a student of another French philosopher who is Jacques Derrida. Now the anecdote, and this has been filmed and broadcast, so the anecdote is that Stiegler was put in prison for armed robbery. He tried to rob a bank 3 times in Toulouse. He was put in prison for 7 years, and when he was in prison, as I worked in Paris 7, as part of your service, you can be asked to teach in the prison. So you can study philosophy in prison. Stiegler started studying philosophy in prison, and the story is that Jacques Derrida is the person who signed his kind of letter of release, who kind of vouched for him as a citizen, if you wish. So Stiegler and Derrida have a very close relationship, philosophically, and Derrida's text from 1968, which is called the Pharmacie de Platon, which is Plato's pharmacy. In the history of philosophy, it's a really important text, because this is where we get the invention, if you wish, of the notion of deconstruction happens within this text in 1968. And here what we get is an understanding of words or writing as a form of pharmacon. Now the quotation that you have on the screen there, that's from Plato's Phaedrus. the context is that Plato always has, Socrates, Plato, they're always done in a dialogue. So the dialogue is with Phaedrus, hence the title of the text is the Phaedrus. So Phaedrus and Socrates leave the city of Athens, climb a hill, they look back over the city, and they're talking about love, asking what's the meaning of love, and we have this kind of nonsensical discourse around what love is. And that Socrates notices that Phaedrus has this text under his cloak. He says, well, what's that you've got under your cloak? So, it's a lecture that I heard earlier. So then he goes on to say, to give the history of the birth of writing. And then we have this quotation here. Okay. So what he says, in fact, is that the fact that this invention, writing, will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who have learned it, because they will need to exercise their memories. So the idea here is quite simple. I have my text here, so I can remember what I'm going to say because I've written it down. And what Socrates, Plato says is that's not a cure for memory. Okay. What you have here is a kind of, he calls it a pharmacon. That writing is a pharmacon. It's a cure and a poison for memory. Okay, now I spoke to, we have another project at the minute in neuropsychology, and what we're looking at in the project with Maynooth and Trinity is the process of kind of interconnected memory. So the idea is, put it simply, that the man knows where the hammer is, and the lady of the house knows where the needle and thread is. Okay, so the man doesn't have to kind of say, I don't need to remember where the needle and thread is, because in my interconnected relationship, the other person knows where that is. Okay. So this way of dissipating memory across interconnected relationships is one thing. But in this case, the idea here is that because I write it down, I don't have to remember it, because I have the support. So when I come to the page, then I can remember what I was going to say. Okay. So the philosophical issue here is that what Derrida shows is that we have a fundamental ambiguity. We have a pharmacon, which can be a cure and a poison. It can be both things at once. So here, I'm not going to go into the whole history of deconstruction, but here what you get is that language becomes something which is profoundly unstable. Language is something which is polysemitic. It has multiple meanings. It can mean different things. So from that, Derrida is going to have his whole project of deconstruction is going to fall out of that. Hence, joining up the dots, Stiegler, a student of Derrida, comes back to this question of the pharmacon. And what we find is in that 1968 text, the Plato's Pharmacy, it's about 80 pages long. In the first piece, we have all of the positive and negative effects of the pharmacon, but we never come back to the positive effects. It's all about loss of memory, etc. So the therapeutic aspect of the pharmacon is never revisited by Derrida. Okay. Bringing this forward now, so if we take the notion of writing, language, even Derrida would argue that the tongue itself is a form of technique, is a technology. That to expand on it, so if we say that writing is a form of technology, so within technology itself we have this pharmacological relationship, positive and negative within technology. Then what Stiegler does is takes that analysis and brings it into the digital. And how he does that is by looking at questions of attention. So what's referred to as the economy of attention. The economy today, the rare resource, as Catherine Hales puts it, the rare resource that we have at the moment is attention. My attention that I give to different things. Digital technologies, put briefly, are a way of capturing that attention. So what Stiegler plays out is this analysis of a pharmacological relationship between myself and how I mediate myself in the world, and how these technologies capture my attention, my visual attention, my memory, my thoughts, my feelings, my social network, etc. So technologies, these digital technologies are a way of captivating attention. It's kind of curious, I think there's a TV program next week on RTE. I was looking at it, it's kind of like It's curious how this debate has moved over the last 5 years. Now we have a TV programme by RTE which is going to look at a kind of critique of social networks and how social networks really work, and nothing is free. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that if you go back to the history within philosophy of the term pharmacon, we take that as a negative and positive relationship between memory and the support. What we're doing with that group, Ars Industrialis and the Digital Studies group, is expanding that understanding into all forms of digital technology. Okay? And reading and attention is probably the most obvious one. Okay? Catherine Hales has put forward an argument that we have a surface reading that takes place on the screen as opposed to an in-depth reading that takes place with the text. This is the whole point of debate. There's no proof, there's no physiological proof of this, but the argument is that there are forms of inattention built into digital technologies. So I can stop there. Yeah. I can go on, or
I'll let
Yeah.
say that.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about.
Okay.
And maybe we can just pause for a moment and see if there are any pressing questions. And if there are, we'll attend to them, and if there aren't, we'll keep going. So has anybody got anything in particular that they'd like to address?
we're all baffled into silence.
If I may ask a question,
Yeah.
And I put it in the form of a question then. How does that, or does it link up, or does Stiegler reference what Marshall McLuhan was saying in the 60s in terms of, and he was referring specifically to media technologies, but he had a warning in there which was about attention. It was about how, what he was saying effectively is the technology does change us in the medium is the message. It's not, there's a message, sure, but the medium and how we use it affects what we're talking about, and that seems to me to strike a similar chord in terms of a warning that technology as a tool changes the user of that tool.
I think that there's a lot of parallels with that Marshall McLuhan argument. I think there's a lot of parallels where I think there's a slight difference, I would say, is in an understanding that it's not just one form of media, it's like all forms of technology. But within it, and this is where we have to be a little bit careful, because 3 weeks ago Catherine Hales gave a talk and somebody asked her at the end, do we have any kind of neurophysiological proof that there's a difference here? We do have certain types of proof. So what we have are brain scans of people who read on paper and people who read on screen. But the difficulty is we don't have a false positive. It's very difficult to find somebody who hasn't read something on a screen if you see them. So it's kind of within neuropsychology. It's a whole area of debate. But we do have another person, Anne-Marie Wolf, who puts forward the argument of the digital reading brain, that the neurological development is different, that the way that the synapses fire and how they're interconnected is different to someone who uses digital technologies. In the background here, we have to, again, be very wary, because in the background we have something which is called the Ritalin generation, so children who suffer from ADHD. So ADHD is a hyperactive disorder. So what you have are children who are actually hyperactive. And what Ritalin does is the drug that they use, that's what's called the Ritalin generation, the drug they use is just calms down the overfiring of attention. So here you can see there's a link between uses of inattention, so all forms of technology which are forms of inattention, and a form of hyperattention. That's the argument. Yeah.
I just, on the Ritalin nation, my understanding though is that the tests for that are only if Ritalin it's post-pharm. So if there is no test for hyperactivity prior, it's whether or not Ritalin
has affected.
Would all benefit from it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that.
Yeah.
We'd all be more attentive than sleep. Right?
Yeah.
That's strange, isn't it? But I just wanted to question Dave on the. Is there no argument for earlier than 1870? Because what about the deforestation that was already going on?
Yeah, there are. I mean, it's very detailed. It's a very detailed account of the Anthropocene, and what you do get are arguments around deforestation from the 1700s. Okay, and you get a notion that, and it's amazing when you read it, because what you get are experimentations of forestation where they replant, for example, the same tree in the same area together. And what they find is that that's a very dangerous thing to do, because if there's one disease, the whole crop gets wiped out. So you get early forms of forestation where they begin to realise that what we need to do is kind of have a mixture. But you're correct, the debate about our impact on the environment goes way, way back. Okay, I think, as I said, if you think, one of the things I was thinking of was even in terms of kind of what we call a natural philosophy, which would be kind of the Middle Ages nearly, is a relationship between man and nature, where it's very kind of symbiotic. There's a clear link between the two. I think the other question behind that, though, is that here, when they use the term Anthropocene, they wouldn't go that far back, because it's to do with, as I tried to point out, it's to do with forms of industrialization, which have very obvious toxic effects.
Just on that then, Noel, you're defining the history according to modes of production and technology, but industrialization isn't just modes of production, it's also modes of exchange.
Yeah.
And alienation or impact from industrialization is also through modes of exchange and consumption. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that in relation to the concept of the contributory economy.
Yeah, okay. So as I tried to point out, what you get is this kind of parallel history. Okay, so you get a history of questions around the Anthropocene and a history of particular forms of political economy. The one that comes to mind is early industrialization, hence references to Marx, capital, etc. And then in the 1950s we have a kind of a sudden growth of a form of neoliberal consumerism, and those two things tend to go in parallel. Right? Hence, within this analysis that I'm putting forward through the work of Stiegler, is that if we go back and try and say, what can we do beyond the Anthropocene? What can we do next? So he would argue that the crisis of 2008 and 2009 is just another example of a system which is already in crisis. So what we need to do is come up with another way of thinking about the political economy. Okay? And very interestingly, the project which is taking place at the moment, which is in Plaine Saint-Denis, which is in the northern suburbs of Paris, a very rough area of the city, where there's lots of issues. What the group have done is actually set up a kind of a free university within that commune. And here again, the idea is to move away from a more neoliberal sense of community work, for example. Okay. The contributive economy is the idea that I can contribute, so instead of being a consumer or a producer, I'm a contributor. I contribute to something. And here it's a notion of the greater good or the overall good, something which cannot be monetized, something that cannot be given a value. Okay? So the explanation of this is in France we have something which is called the intermittent de spectacle. So you can be an intermittent person who works in art or in music. What happens is you have a very tightly organized system whereby if you do a strict number of hours as an actor every year, you can apply to become this intermittent de spectacle. And then as you're paid a wage as a cultural producer, as an actor, that comes from this kind of central organization. Okay? But if you're a French singer called Johnny Holiday who makes 14 million euros a year, the money goes into the same place. Okay? So the idea is you can contribute to the central organization which redistributes the wealth amongst that community. Okay? That's a very simple way of explaining the contributive economy or the economy of contribution. But the thing is that there's something within it, a value within that contribution which goes beyond the monetary value. Okay? Now here, this is something that I've become involved with recently in Ireland around a text which is called The Value of the Humanities. So it's a text which has been written for the government about justification of the value of the humanities. And the problem with it is there's a value which cannot be calculated. There's a value which cannot be measured or put into numerical value or monetized. So you have the most important value you can add is the one which escapes that process of measurement. So the contributive economy is the notion that I can have this process of redistributing wealth, but also within it acknowledging that there's something which is beyond
monetary value.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Noel. I think if people don't mind, we will pause there. Thank you for a wonderfully stimulating conversation. I feel that this was such a rich presentation that
we only got page 3.
Yeah, that there's a lot left unsaid, and perhaps it might lead to groups forming here to investigate further and maybe get some references from you in relation to other books that to read around. Because I think a lot of what you brought today was new to most ears in relation to the contributive economy. So